Oh, we got a real blast from the past with this one, and one in which carries a lot of history, especially with one familiar name that is attached to this series. And what I am talking about is, of course, Future Boy Conan, released back in 1978, brought to us by Nippon Animation. And the reason why, to this day, you see some anime fans that are familiar with Future Boy Conan, or at the very least that they would have heard of this, is mainly because this series is noted to be directed by the animation legend himself, Hayao Miyazaki. And not only that, but this is actually noted to be his first true directorial debut, or the first time that he really took the position as the director of a prominent project such as Future Boy Conan. Now, this is not to say that this was his first time directing ever, considering that he did take on the role a little bit on a few episodes of Lupin the Third in the past, back in the early 1970s. But in this case, though, with Future Boy Conan, this is the first time where he was the main director of everything. Like, he was the director of the whole series. Sure, there were a few directors who did work on the individual episodes, such as Isao Takahata, whom, of course, he would later team up with Hayao Miyazaki in order to go and form Studio Ghibli alongside Toshio Suzuki. But in the case of Future Boy Conan, like I said before, the main director of all this is Hayao Miyazaki. In fact, it's also interesting to note that this is actually one of his earlier projects before he would jump onto movies. In fact, the year after Future Boy Conan, Hayao Miyazaki would go and make his feature directorial debut with The Castle of Cagliostro. So this is one thing that I'll just say now you have to really keep in mind about Future Boy Conan, is that this is technically a Hayao Miyazaki project, or in a way you could say a prototype of a Hayao Miyazaki project. Trust me, I will get into that and it will make sense a little later. But considering that right now, yes, I have been requested on Patreon where someone did ask me to look into Future Boy Conan, I decided, why the fridge not? I'll go and take on the challenge, and we will see, even after all these decades, if this project still lives up, if it is still worth watching, and if this is a series that is worthy to be in the caliber of a Hayao Miyazaki project. So, without further ado, is Future Boy Conan worth watching? Well, let's find out. And since I've already mentioned it, I might as well get this out immediately, and that is the factor that this is a Hayao Miyazaki project. And I'll say with Future Boy Conan, it's actually hard to let go of that concept, to let go of the idea that this is made by Hayao Miyazaki. I know I'm pretty much saying that it is hard to separate the art from the artist, but in this case here, that's what I find to be so fascinating when watching this entire series, is to see all of these elements that would later on really shape what makes a Hayao Miyazaki movie, all of these signature traits where we kind of see some of the first steps being developed in Future Boy Conan. And there's a lot of these that you would find that it will go and remind you of some of the animated films that Hayao Miyazaki would go and make later on. Of course, this has a very prominent theme of environmentalism. In fact, this is actually set in a post-apocalyptic future where after this great war in 2008, yeah, by the way, that's just a little bit of a side note. There are some things that maybe may not have aged well, but still, we just have to go and roll along with it. I guess they didn't really know any better in the past. But then again, I guess if you would go and ask Wall Street, 2008 did feel like the apocalypse. But anyways, back to what I was talking about. The whole synopsis of this is that after the Great War in 2008, we're set in this post-apocalyptic post-apocalyptic future where both war and climate change pretty much destroyed the Earth as we know it. And we will look into the few survivors that managed to live their lives on different islands. And then you would have Conan, whom suddenly he discovers this girl who washed up ashore on his island. And from there, she would be captured by the bad guys that live in a more man-made island or a man-made infrastructure called Industria. So from there, Conan would go and meet up with allies or people who would later become allies in order to go and save Lana and learn more about the world that is around him, like to learn about what has happened and life after the war and what has happened in this post-apocalyptic world, or the future Boy Conan version of the post-apocalyptic world. So yes, as you can see, since I did mention that climate change played a significant factor in this post-apocalyptic world, environmentalism is a very prominent theme within this series. And not only that, but also the different ways that it would go and use environmentalism for its storytelling. It plays a very significant role in its world building. It plays a significant role in the backgrounds, the way that they would go and portray the post-apocalyptic world, not as like devastating or that it has become this barren wasteland, but more of this nature-dominant post-apocalypse where it's a lot more serene, it's a lot more peaceful, it's a lot more calm. Like vegetation has pretty much taken over everything, including a lot of the buildings, and even the ocean would go and sink up a lot of the cities out there, which is another prominent theme with Hayao Miyazaki, that when he wants to show life after the world would end, it would show it more in a positive light, in a more colorful and serene and more beautiful in a way. One in which that actually looks pretty nice, more so than something that seems barren. Or actually, one thing I almost forgot to mention is that technically, this is actually based on a book. And I have in my notes here that this is specifically based on the novel called The Incredible Tide by Alexander Key. And the showrunners, they were not Hayao Miyazaki, but it was the showrunners who ultimately decided that they want this to be more fun-filled, to be a bit more positive. So instead of being all doom and gloom with its post-apocalyptic vision like they did in the novel, they decided to show it more positively. And I could see that be an influence in Hayao Miyazaki and in a lot of his works, where he would show the world ending or the world in trouble in a way that doesn't look as bad, or it is visually stunning, or showing nature being a powerful force. And that's also another theme, by the way, which is how nature is much more powerful than whatever man could go and create. So that is also another element that you would find. So I can go on, and probably I'll bring up more as I would go and continue with this review. But the point that I am making is that what makes this so interesting to watch from an animation enthusiast perspective is the fact that you see all of these elements that Hayao Miyazaki would really explore, and he would experiment with this series that he would later go and use it upon his films when he would create Studio Ghibli. There's a lot of this in which it reminds me a lot of Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. And then there are some that remind me a bit of Princess Mononoke, and even some of the more recent films. Like, I see parts of it that kind of reminds me of The Boy and the Heron. But I will say, though, if there is one movie that I would say this reminds me the most of, it would have to be Castle in the Sky. And it's funny to mention because before I fully jumped into this review, the person who requested me this also asked me to do an art commission where it would be like a crossover between the main characters of Future Boy Conan, specifically Conan and Lana, meeting up with Patsu and Shita from Castle in the Sky. And the reason is because he told me that those two projects are just very similar and it would make sense to see this crossover. And after watching this series, it got me interested into looking or revisiting Castle in the Sky just to go and fully watch it again and to have a fresh reminder. And even as I was watching this, of course, there were elements that did remind me of that film. But now, from recently watching both, I could definitely say that yeah, the parallels are very much uncanny. I'm not saying that Castle in the Sky is like some kind of spiritual successor or is like some kind of film adaptation to Future Boy Conan, but the similarities are very much there, especially with the two leads, with Patsu and Shita, how, of course, they are very much like Conan and Lana. You got the world building element of how Conan would go and talk a lot about places like High Harbor and Industria, and then you would have Castle in the Sky that would really go in depth into Laputa and the world building of that. Even the story feels very similar about trying to go and find like the ultimate resource and try to stop the villain from using it for his own selfish needs in order to go and fully take over the world. And again, I tried researching to see if there actually is some kind of connection, if Hayao Miyazaki took some inspiration from Future Boy Conan in order to go and develop Castle in the Sky. But I guess the connections are kind of a coincidence, but still, it is very intriguing to see those parallels. And again, it plays a significant part as to why it was so fascinating to watch this and just see the prototypes of those elements that would later become signature traits of a Hayao Miyazaki movie. And I think that is probably the main selling point, at least for an animation fan like myself, to see why it is so fascinating to watch this series or why it is worth it. It's kind of like an educational piece where you kind of see the origins of the things that ultimately make a Studio Ghibli movie. And speaking of world building, by the way, that's also another thing that I would like to go and mention as one of the strong points of Future Boy Conan is that it actually does a good job crafting its own world and discussing about what happened after the Great War of 2008, where you see this post-apocalyptic world and how do the survivors do what they can in order to try to survive, and how these different worlds or these different islands per se that they're trying to manage things onto their own way. But then again, there's also some of the traits from the old world, I guess you could say, that they're still messing things around and they end up making things worse for the entire planet, especially when you still have elements of colonialism that's still going on, where you have this distribution of power, like a bit of a hierarchy system that is building up that's also corrupting people's minds in a way, and why you see a bit of backstabbing from people within each other. So you do have those old traits that are causing problems amongst the people, but for the most part, you also see ways of how they're trying to manage in this post-apocalyptic world and how they're trying to rebuild their own civilization. And you mostly watch this through the lens of Conan himself, whom throughout his life only understands the life of his own little island living with his grandpa. But then as he leaves, he starts to learn a bit more about the world around him, where there is more of a culture than it is just using your survival instincts. And you see more and more, not just of what happens to the world, but also how they would go and use energy as well. Considering that energy is also a very prominent theme within this entire series, where they would go and discuss about how Industria would go and try to survive using nuclear power and even recycling plastics for any means necessary, even recycling plastic for food, oddly enough. But then they would also look into other resources, where you see in another island in High Harbor where they would use wind energy. And then, of course, you got the big MacGuffin of this entire series, which is solar power, in which the main villain of it all, Lepka, is desperately seeking for solar energy so that he can fully take over the world with that thing. So with the world building, there is that element where it makes it interesting in itself, where you see how this entire world is built upon, how people are trying to survive, how they're trying to build back their own culture after everything that's been going on, and how they're trying to stop the forces of evil. So there's a lot of those where it plays a role into the engagement of this entire series. But then there is another thing that I just want to say right now is probably my biggest criticism with the series, and probably the main thing that holds it back from being great, or even holds it back from being as good as many other Hayao Miyazaki projects that he would go and do later on, and that is with the characters. I'm just going to say now that these characters take a lot of time to actually be invested, or to be rooting for, or to support, or you want to see their growth as this whole thing would go and progress. Because I'll say now, at the very least with many of them, they don't leave a good first impression. They could seem a bit dickish, they could seem very cliched, very tropey, or they kind of make this a little bit mean-spirited, where it would just take a lot of time to see any appeal or charm to them. In fact, I'm just going to say right now, from my experience, it took me more than half of the entire series, or I would even go and say at the max, it took me 3/4 of the way in order for me to feel fully invested onto these characters, for me to accept them for who they are, and to actually enjoy the whole adventure, and to see Conan save the day and stuff like that. But it's just that, again, it just takes a lot of time to actually reach to that point. But in the meantime, you're kind of stuck with these characters that, yeah, you might be interested in seeing the whole world that's around them, but you are kind of tagged along with these people that at first I just didn't really feel fond of. And there are some that, they're not terrible, even the first time you meet them, but there are some elements that, I don't know, I just don't feel like they're handled that well. Or even in terms of, I don't know if it would be either the writing or the story, but it's just, I feel like they could be handled better in order to make a better first impression, in order for you to go and get along with what they would do. I'll give you some examples. In fact, I'll go and talk about the main characters, Conan and Lana. With Conan, I mean, yeah, he was, he seems fine. I would say throughout the whole thing, or at least the majority of it, he is the most likable character, where he doesn't know the world around him, and that he would really just depend on his survival instincts in order to go and, well, of course, survive, where he has great hunting skills, he has great physical stamina. He has what it takes in order to live on an island and just be perfectly fine. But the most social interaction that he would have is with his grandfather. And then early on in the series, or at least in the first few episodes, well, he would have to learn to live without his grandfather. But the thing, and then of course, actually, before I continue on that part, then you have, of course, Lana, who's the first to show that there is more to this world than just Conan's little island. And she would, for the most part, be a bit of a damsel in distress, where she would often get kidnapped. But then it would be up to Conan to come in and rescue her. But she, along with solar energy, her role is very much like a MacGuffin, but she does have a bit of a personality of her own. But the one thing that I will say that honestly makes it difficult to be fully engaged with them is that this series honestly really tests out your suspension of disbelief when it comes to their powers. And I'm talking about specifically with Conan's super strength and Lana's telepathy powers, where, okay, I understand that when it comes to Conan, with the way that he has to live, of course, he would be the kind that would learn to be stronger than your typical kid, to breathe underwater longer than your typical kid, or hold his breath longer underwater than your typical kid. Like, yeah, he would have those abilities be heightened, but this series would really play it up to the point where we entered upon superhero powers. Like, we're at the point where Conan would suddenly have, like, superhuman strength to the point where they exaggerate the kind of, like, power that Conan would hold. It's almost to the point that it gets a little too over the top. It's like almost jumping the shark, but eventually there's a point where I kind of just give up on questioning how powerful he is. It's like, okay, you know what? Fine. Like, he's at, like, okay, fine. Conan is as strong as Superman. I guess we'll just roll with it. But then you have Lana, who has telepathy powers, and that is a way for her to go and communicate with both Conan and her grandfather, who would later play a very significant role in this series. And when it comes to that one, I feel like it just becomes very out of place, mainly because they don't actually explain how she would have her powers. Where did those powers come from? It's just one of those things where the series just accepts you to, it expects you to just accept the fact that Lana has telepathy powers, and yeah, that's it. Like, they don't really go into detail, at least with Castle in the Sky. Like, when we do see Sheeta having powers, at least they do give out some context with her connection with Laputa, and that a lot of it comes from the crystal. But with Lana in Future Boy Conan, on the other hand, they just say that she has telepathy powers, and that is a way for her to know if either Conan or her grandfather is okay. Deal with it. But then you do have the other characters whom, like I said, take a lot of time in order to, at the very least, get used to, because their first impression is just not that great. Yes, they do have a significant character arc throughout the series, but it just takes a long time to get there. And before they do actually reach the point where they are actually charming, or that they are at least fun to watch, for the most part, when you see them come in, they can either be annoying or they can make the series feel a little bit mean-spirited. Like, one example is Jimshi, where he would start things off as, like, the wild sidekick to Conan, a little bit like Inosuke from Demon Slayer, but in this case here, like, a lot of the personality that he would have, they don't really use it all that much, and whenever they would present his personality, a lot of it is just to be the wild child, and that pretty much translates to the kid who doesn't really follow rules and likes to smoke and likes to drink alcohol and stuff like that. So yeah, Jim Shi is one of those that, like, he's mostly like just a typical sidekick at first, and when he would have something that would stand out, it's not really an appealing trait, but then it would be much later on, like at least much further into the second half of the series, where okay, like he starts to change his attitude and becomes a more likable personality. Or another good example that you would have is Captain Dice, who is a lot more of a comic relief. And he starts out as this Team Rocket style antagonist where he's not the main villain per se, but he's mostly goofy with his approach and he's mostly there to make people laugh. But then there is the factor where he would have this shtick where he has this crush on Lana, and that there would be times where he would try to persuade her to love him, but he would also have a short temper whenever things don't go his way. And keep in mind that with Lana, she is still presented as a little girl. Like, they still mention the fact that she is legitimately a kid, that she is a full-on minor. And I'm just gonna say it right now, that thing right there, there's no way to describe it other than just flat out gross. In fact, it is the one thing that is the most outdated aspect of Future Boy Conan, even more so than that Great War of 2008 thing. And look, I know there are going to be some people out there that they're going to try to fill in some context related to Japanese culture or how things were back in the late 1970s to explain how this was acceptable back then. But no, I'm not going to go and like try to walk around this issue. Like I'm going to lay it out right here of what this is. This is a character, an adult man who has the hots for a minor. We know what this is. This is basically like a child predator thing right there. I don't care what the context is. It's flat out wrong, no matter what it may be, no matter what the context is, no matter what the time period is, no matter who is making it, no matter where it's from. This is just universally wrong no matter what. And this needs to be called out for, and that we need to say that this is not okay. And the fact that this series is trying to present this as like a comical thing or like just a quirk from Captain Dice, no, that's just flat out wrong. I mean, we've recently had to deal with Dr. Disrespect. We don't need another one with Captain Dice. But the point that I want to make is that if there is a downside to this series, it's honestly with these characters where they take a lot of time to go and get used to. And even though, yes, there are still some good aspects like the world building that does help out with the storytelling or even the action scenes that I'll talk about later, for the most part, if there's one thing that does hold me back a little bit from truly engaging with this series throughout the whole thing, it would be the characters. It's just, I don't feel like it is as fun when I would have to go into these adventures with them specifically. Yes, later on, they do have some appeal, and as we do get closer to the end of it, it does get fully engaging. It does get fully, fully enjoyable, and like even the characters do have their charm after they go through some of their major arcs. But still, though, I cannot ignore that it takes quite a while to reach that point specifically. But then you have the animation, and that is honestly something that I feel like is pretty mixed. Like, it's a complex subject when talking about the animation of Future Boy Conan, or at least my thoughts on it, because on one hand, I'm just going to say right now, it is good, and you could see that they had a very talented team working upon Future Boy Conan. In fact, you can actually see a lot of the elements that are from Hayao Miyazaki, where you see those familiar traits onto this series, from the character designs to the backgrounds to the color palettes, a lot of it is familiar to Hayao Miyazaki, and even the characters themselves all even say that there are some that they actually look familiar. And even going back to the comparison of Castle in the Sky, there are even some characters that even in their role, they look very much familiar to what you would go and find in Castle in the Sky, where you would look at future Boy Conan, and rather it be through their designs or even the archetypes that they play, that they do share that similar role, or they are very much similar to what you would find in Castle in the Sky. So there are those elements in which, yeah, it is definitely good. You see that craftsmanship. But the problem with the animation is that it is very messy. This honestly feels like a very messy series in terms of its visuals. And I say this because there's something about it that I could be wrong, but it's either that the production was just very rushed, or they didn't have a sufficient budget in order to go and animate this series, or maybe it is both. Because there's just so much of it that it feels very messy, that the animators did not have time to really go and polish it. And sometimes I do mean that literally, because one consistent problem that you would find is the animation cells are very messy. Like, these are the kinds that obviously they have recycled them from a previous series that they would work on. And instead of buying new clean cells in order to go and ink and paint them and put them on display, like, this was obviously washed off. This was already used. And then they would go and try to go and use that. But you would see a lot of the stains, a lot of the usage of it. Like, you see a lot of these like stains or like these different imperfections in there that you could tell that they use some pretty unclean or messy cells in order to go and animate this. Like, you'll see a lot of those technical errors, or at least like those little goofs or like little things that obviously should not be there, that they would keep popping up throughout the series. But not only that, but there are times when even the animation can sometimes bite off more than it could chew, where sometimes, like, you'll see some very intricate cinematography. And of course, Hayao Miyazaki lend a great hand in terms of the storyboarding, where you do get some great intricate shots. But when it comes to pulling them off, sometimes they're not necessarily as great, especially when you do have those landscape shots, or you would see characters from afar where they would be more and more blobby, where, yeah, I do get it. Like, when you do back away from characters in a cartoon, so, like, especially in an older cartoon, like, there would be a lot of details that would have to be sacrificed. But this one, however, they would really take it to the next level, where you would see it be, again, I know I keep repeating this word, where it is a bit messy, it is a bit unclean, and sometimes they would take away a lot of its details to the point of looking a little too simplistic, and it looks a little bit more like running blobs than it actually is with people. In fact, I'll even add that sometimes there is too much of a separation between the backgrounds and the characters, where you can obviously tell which components are from the animation cells, which ones are the things that are supposed to move, and which are the things that are just on the backgrounds. And I mean, yeah, you do see that all the time with cartoons, even with American ones, not to mention like Hanna-Barbera often would have that trait. But in this case here, I feel like it is way more noticeable than usual, including those moments where you would see characters from afar and how those like little blobs, they would really stand out compared to their painted backgrounds. shows. Again, I want to clarify that this is good animation. The animation team definitely did a great job at it, and they made the most out of the materials that they had, but there's something about it that just feels extremely unpolished, where there's a lot of messiness, and that if they had a bit more time or they had a bit more of a budget in order to at least clean off those imperfections, then it would have made this animation great. But there's just something about it that honestly has this rushed sense into it, that it's more about getting, they got a very talented team, but their goal is to make sure that it's to get those scenes done more so than to actually make those scenes great. But then again, on the flip side, I do want to go and discuss about the action scenes, and that is probably the best thing from the animation, because regardless of how rushed or unpolished that the animation itself looks, I will give it that if there is one thing that is consistently engaging other than the world building, it has to be the action scenes. There is a lot of really fun action scenes that they would do, and a lot of creative action scenes that they would go and do as well. Rather, they would be underwater, or you would have a lot that's on land, or even by boat, or even a lot of it would be in the skies, which of course is another element that you would commonly find in Hayao Miyazaki films, especially with his fascination with airplanes. So there's a lot of great action that you would go and find, and you would get engaged with it, if not for these characters, but for those cool action scenes, to see what's the next action-packed scenario that you would find Conan get into next, and how he would try to go and get out of what major mess he would find himself in whenever he would go and try to rescue Lana, or to stop Industria from having their plans come to fruition. Like, those moments, I will say, they are definitely good. That's where they make the most out of the cinematography in this, with the storyboarding, or with a lot of the pacing. Like, that's where most of the animation, or at least most of the best parts of the animation, would be found in here. And not to mention a lot of great use of hand-drawn visual effects, like a lot of the explosions that would go occur, or a lot of the shooting that would happen. I understand that when it comes to building special effects in hand-drawn, it can be extremely difficult. Some could even say some of the hardest things to do in hand-drawn, but they actually work out very well in this. So that is one thing that I will say. If it weren't for the action scenes, then it would honestly feel very rough to get into future Boy Conan. So I will give it with the action. It does a great job to get you immersed into this, along with the world building. So at least, like, if nothing else, if you're not into the characters, then at least the action scenes can help you out in order to give you a reason to say, keep watching, because we got more of these cool stuff happening. But there is one more element that I do want to talk about, and I feel like it is very important to Future Boy Conan, in which it makes itself be presented more than just this fun-filled post-apocalyptic world filled with cool action scenes. Like, it makes it show that there is much more to that there is much more to say about Future Boy Conan, or that it wants to go and explain to its audience about this. And on top of that, this is actually something that you would also regularly find in Hayao Miyazaki's future projects, that he would go and present, and he would repeat these messages later on. And that is the political commentary. And one that I've already explained, one that I've already talked about, because it is such a major thing in Hayao Miyazaki's movies, but it is the factor of environmentalism, and how that is very prominent throughout future Boy Conan, more so than just to set up the world building. But along with that, there is this prominent theme of environmentalism versus industrialism. And they do so in a way that I would say is much more straightforward than the way it was presented in Princess Mononoke. Obviously, with environmentalism being the good guys and industrialism being the bad guys. And along with it, showing this commentary of how the forces of nature will always be more powerful than the forces of man. That no matter what man will do in order to try to survive, in order to try to fight back against those forces, nature will be dominant and will always find a way to be stronger no matter what. Like, even take things that man would build upon for hundreds, even thousands of years, and just take that down in mere seconds, that it would go and do that. It is nothing compared to what nature can offer with earthquakes and tsunamis and all that kind of stuff. So that is one thing that this series would go and heavily emphasize with its environmentalism. In fact, with the way that it shows how nature would go and become the dominant force in this post-apocalyptic world, that is another aspect that really does emphasize environmentalism and the forces of the environment, in which they would go and explain that it is much better to go and work with nature than it is to go against it. And not only that, but this is also prominent in Hayao Miyazaki's commentary on the types of energy in relation to the environment. The way that they would show how Industria is fueled with nuclear energy and recycling plastic as a way for it to go and survive. Where in contrast, they would go and talk about how wind energy and solar energy is just superior in every way. How they portray solar energy as like the ultimate source, the ultimate way in order to go and gather energy that is far superior than anything else. And even showing wind power as well, as it would be the source of energy in order to fuel the work of the town of High Harbor, that they would go and show the positives of wind energy. In a way, kind of showing how these environmentally friendly fuel sources such as solar power and wind power are superior and more beneficial to people than nuclear and recycling plastic, and the kind of energy that requires a lot more man-made power. And then, of course, there is another commentary outside of environmentalism, is that this is a very anti-fascist series, that this pretty much clarifies how evil fascism can be and what people should do in order to go and fight against it. And this is definitely presentable with the way that they show the antagonistic characters, how they would have these authoritarian or fascist-like ideologies, like the kind that you would commonly see in many right-wing politicians, not just in the United States, but even in all around the world. And this is definitely the case where you would see, like, there are some bad guys where they would share a similar archetype, where they would have this selfish attitude, or they're more, that they're the kinds that they would be bullies, where they think that they can have power by, like beating down people, like punching down their way to the top, and that whenever things don't go their way, they are willing to go and accept the help of Industria in order to climb their way to the top. And then, of course, you do have the main villain, Lepka, who very much is what you would expect out of a far-right politician, or something that came straight out of the pages of the Heritage Foundation. Someone who is very much a dictator, who's very power-hungry, and just desperately wants to be a dictator. Like, the series would even clarify that he very much wants to be a dictator that wants to use force in order to go and take over the world, that he just wants to be above everyone else. And from there, you would see the whole battle of fighting against these fascist-minded people and the forces of Industria that represent fascism. And this is in contrast to the allies that you would see Conan would go and team up, especially the people at High Harbor, how they would go and portray it as a town that is very much community driven, that has this very socialist culture in order to maintain the entire town, in order to provide food, in order to provide clothes, that everybody has a role in order to make this entire town function, that everybody is essentially equal in this. But then, of course, you would also see Industria as the fascists come in, that they would be very colonialist and authoritarian in the way that they want to go and rule, that they want to try to cover as much land as possible in order to go and gain more power. And then you would see people like Conan and his allies as well, with Lana, Jimshi, and the other characters they would meet along the way to go and fight against fascism. I would even say by the end of the series, with the final few episodes, funny enough, it pretty much turns into Star Wars, where it's pretty much the big battle of the rebels versus the Empire, where you would have the people that are among the lower class that the conservative-minded leaders just want to go and eliminate because they know that they're going to be in the way of their plans, but the rebels would go out of their way to really fight against them and to compete against the soldiers that want to, that would use their guns to fight them. But they would go and, like, with the power of their numbers, that they would try to go and defeat Industria and defeat the fascist mindset of Lepka. So there are those political tones that you would see again much later in Hayao Miyazaki's movies, that later on that he would develop this environmentalist and anti-fascist commentary that would be prominent in films such as Porco Rosso or Princess Mononoke or Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, that this would carry on for Hayao Miyazaki. And from there, like I said before, it gives Future Boy Conan this extra layer of intrigue, where there is this interesting layer to it that it does make it thought-provoking. It does make it interesting to watch. And I'll even say right now, with how the world is fighting against fascism as I am recording this, oddly enough, kind of makes it very timely as well, that it kind of works out very well if you do watch this today, if you need some kind of encouragement or to have a good idea of what to do when combating against far-right politicians that are desperate for power, or to fight against the rise of fascism, So there is something about it, like, even though there are a few elements that did not age well, there are some elements as well that actually aged very well. I would even say that have aged perfectly in order to give out an anti-fascist commentary. So overall, when it comes to Future Boy Conan, it's honestly a very fascinating series that, even though it does take a lot of time in order to get into, I still say it is a lot of fun. And I would even say, yeah, it's actually pretty worth it in the end. I find it to be very fascinating to see all those elements from Hayao Miyazaki movies that would later be developed in his future films, where it's almost like you see the origins of the signature traits of many beloved Studio Ghibli movies, where they would take some of their first steps in Future Boy Conan, and then you would see how they would go and evolve into what we love into those features. So there is that level of intrigue and fascination that you would get in there if you have that interest in Studio Ghibli films. But even on its own, it does have elements that really do stand out. I will give it that there are some problems that, like I said before, the characters take a lot of time, and some people may say maybe it would take too much time in order to fully get invested into them so that you could fully be on board with this series. That, and also the animation can be pretty rough, and it can be pretty messy, where sometimes it can take you out of it whenever there are times where you see a lot of imperfections. Sometimes they would dominate the screen even. But still, though, it still has a lot of great traits. Even though the animation is not clean, it is still good, and it has a lot of strong artistry as well. The action scenes are really engaging, and the world building actually does a pretty good job in order to go and develop the story. So there's a lot more pros than there are cons in this. Now, for my personal recommendation, I would say that this series is definitely worth watching if you are a fan of Studio Ghibli. If you love the Hayao Miyazaki films, if you love the entire library of Studio Ghibli, then I would definitely recommend that you go and check this one out. In fact, it's not that hard to go and find, considering that recently as I am recording this, G-Kids actually did put out Future Boy Conan on physical media, like on DVD and Blu-ray. So you can go and check that one out. Just pick up your copy and you can go and watch it, and you will have that fascination, just like I did, where you will see those comparisons to Studio Ghibli films, and that those same vibes that you would get in Hayao Miyazaki movies, they are still prominently here as well. So that's my highest recommendation. So like for those fans, yeah, this is definitely a must watch. And for everyone else, I mean, like, it is worth checking out, but I don't know if I would say it is a high recommendation per se. I don't know if I would really go as far and say that, yeah, no, you really gotta go and really watch this. Again, I would personally recommend that you go and check out Castle in the Sky, not only because it is much shorter, where you could just watch this for 2 hours, but also I do feel like it does manage to fix up a lot of the errors that Future Boy Conan has done. But still, though, if you're willing to go and watch the entire series, I think you'll end up having a good time and be happy with what you have seen. And as for my rating, honestly, I have contemplated to give this a 7 out of 10, but honestly, it's during this review, as I am talking about this, I guess I kind of convinced myself where I'm actually going to go and give this an 8 out of 10. Yes, there are definitely a lot of problems with this series, but I would lie if I say that I didn't enjoy my time by the end of it. And yes, by the time I did finish it up, honestly, I was happy with what I was watching, and I did actually enjoy the characters at the end. So I did end up having a pretty good time with this. So yeah, I think, all around a pretty solid series. And even though it does take time in order to show its true appeal, it does get there. And all around, a great look into the history of Hayao Miyazaki and see some of his earlier works before he would go and make some of his greatest works with Studio Ghibli. And that should be it for this review of Future Boy Conan. And I would like to give out a huge thanks to Jose Usagi Archuleta for his amazing support on Patreon that allowed him to get this review. And also, if you would like to be like Jose and you want to go and support my work and get some amazing rewards, including but not limited to seeing my videos before anyone else, then all you have to do is go to patreon.com/animat. And as for you watching this, if you enjoyed listening to me talking about future Boy Conan, if you guys had a great time with this review, then don't forget to go and hit that like button and to subscribe to my channel for more of my animated antics, where I would go and do many more reviews, especially animated movies, and of course, talking about the history of many of your beloved animated features, and more of my zaniness. So, with that said and done, I would like to say thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, see you later, dudes!